Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome again to another podcast episode of Talk Architecture, and I'm your host, Naziaty Muhammad Yaacob. It's very interesting when I browse through the Facebook pages, especially of former students who are now full-fledged architects and doing the thing out there, giving reviews and becoming part of the jury and advisory for different schools of architecture. In Malaysia, there are more and more schools of architecture. And what is interesting, Mitch is from Borneo, if I'm not mistaken, from Sarawak. And he posted 7 hours ago on his Facebook page the title Concept, Context, and Content. Okay, I would like to read some of the passages in his post. And basically, this is what had transpired recently for him. Last Tuesday, as an advisory panel, which is Mitch, had the opportunity to review the works of the Masters of Architecture students from UNIMAS, UNIMAS. I believe that is from Sarawak. With the review, by the end of the semester, I have seen not only the works of students from the UITM Kota Samarahan, but also from UTS and UNIMAS. Apart from that, as a critique panel, I also had the opportunity to hear presentations of students from Indonesia, Singapore, and Thailand in the Four Nations Live Design Discourse, LDD. So there are photographs of Mitch and many others in this event in his post. Okay. Excuse me. In the Four Nations LDD, which includes Malaysia as well, it was interesting to hear different point of views of the sites in Kuching, Sarawak, from students and architects outside of Kuching, with a series of in-depth analysis and urban design presentations. It was exciting to hear presentations with great energy and enthusiasm, particularly the ones with distinct Thai and Indonesian accents. At the time when I attended and participated in all the sessions, the question of Malaysian identity in architecture resurfaced in a local newspaper a few months ago. The article was shared and commented by many, especially those in the architectural fraternity. And me as the host of Talk Architecture, I also presented an episode on that, commented on that said article in the local newspaper. So Mitch continued that it reminded him of one of the essays that he had read many years ago. That year, he applied to do architecture at University of Malaya. And to cut the story short, he was handed a copy of Professor Ezrin Arbi's writing an essay entitled Ke Arah Seni Bina Beridentiti Malaysia, which is translated as Towards an Malaysian Architecture Identity, which is a premier sort of a lecture at University of Malaya. So that was his first introduction to the issue of Malaysian identity. I have mentioned about 1984 during my time when I was a student that I had encountered such thing. And in any presentation or critique session, Mitch Moss says that most of the time, if not all the time, we do not discuss the question of identity, as digital media has been widely used in the design process. Form has become the predetermined factor in many architectural design. This is kind of interesting that I was just also reading about how the country insisted on using artificial intelligence in education in universities. So I was imagining the use of AI to be integrated into the architecture design process. And I was asking one lecturer about this. Is computational design equal to architectural design? And she quickly said no. So how are you going to have AI in architecture design process from the beginning? It's all about forms, isn't it? Okay, anyway, back to what Mitch Moss is saying. So architecture, this is important. What he says, architecture becomes the production of images instead of the production of knowledge. As a result, architecture is perceived as a knowledge of form rather than a form of knowledge. Okay. The one with the production of images is what's happening, isn't it? When you talk about AI integrated into architecture design. Thus, in any presentation or critique sessions, I would usually prefer to hear the first 3 points of the 3 C's, which is the title of his post: concept, context, and content. So, okay, there are a couple more paragraphs in which Mitch further says other things, but which are good points. But I will want to stop here and talk about this concept, content, and context, 3 C's. Of all those 3 words, concept we know, concept is the concept of a chair, the concept of a door, the concept of a roof, the concept of a table, the concept of space, the concept of an elderly housing, or the concept of a museum, the concept. Could be different concept. Zahadid would do this concept, and Frank Gehry would do another concept, or a Malaysian architect would do a different concept, and so on. So are you expecting the Malaysian architect to do a Malaysian identity? I don't know about this, right? Concept. Because concept is like your representation of that building type or that design problem. So there can be concept is something that is very general, or something to describe many things. And then you're talking about content. Content is to do with what is to be said, what is the story. And he did mention about that later, which I would talk about that later. I would quote what he said, what Mitch Moss said. But then I'm going back to content. And content is basically that something substantial is going on and not just form making. So content is quite general as well. But out of those 3 C's, I'm looking at context. And context is what it's all about. And the problem with context now, when I was studying architecture before, I thought, or I was believed to believe, that context is about site context. It's about the physical, environmental surroundings. But I've had a conversation about this before, referring to Kevin Matlow's small projects, that context to do with people as well. And so this is something that is what it's all about. It's about people meeting with other people, exchange of ideas, the meaning of life, and to do with a lot of things that is more memorable than the architecture itself. So I'm now going to talk about, before I go into that deeper, I'm going to just read a quote from what he said here to give credit to what Mitch has written. Nationalism and national identity were famously explored by Benedict Anderson in his work Imagine Communities, published in the early 1980s. It was in the same era as well that the movement of national identity in architecture emerged in Malaysia. Yes, I was mentioning about 1984, right? The question and importance of identity, however, was already highlighted by Ibn Khaldun in the Muqaddimah in 1377, many centuries ago. Okay, I haven't read Ibn Khaldun, neither have I read Benedict Anderson, to be honest. Okay, he described the importance of collective identity or group solidarity in the formation of a nation. Without it, there's no civilization. Well, if 1377, I forgot what era that was in Islamic or Muslim architecture. Was that, when was that? Was it the blue, not Ottoman. Ottoman is 10th century or 11th century. 13th century, we were talking about the region, is Mughal architecture at that time happening. I'm trying to recall which was the era during the 14th century, because that was when the Moors started to lose, isn't it? That's when the Renaissance was going up and there was the Arab civilization, or it's Muslim civilization happening at the same time. And those embellishment or those transfiguration of previous forms, they endured. And they endured because they would work in stone, work in material that are durable and long-lasting. And they represent the nation because these are mosques or these are institutions that that people come to admire from afar. It's like those are the different ages where we have different values as we have compared to now. So I was thinking about all these thoughts on identities. If it's Benedict Anderson in the 1980s, then we have the rise of or the emergence of postmodernist thought and translate to postmodernist language in architecture by Charles Jenks and others. Yeah. So there were debates in the 1980s quite fervently about postmodernism, which led to trying to find our identity. So this led to all those buildings, postmodern buildings in Malaysia, after they explored all the geometries and modern, shall we say, Le Corbusier's forms or inspiration, and all those works during the, the search for identity in the 60s was to do with the independence of Malaysia, and the forms that they borrowed were more environmentally friendly. Then after that is looking into traditional manifestation, or the forms that you found in region to do with the roof, because the roof is, shall we say, in certain countries you want it to be a deep roof because you want the snow not to go and stay up there. But in tropical countries you want the roof to be deep because you want the rain to get out of there. So it is more to do with the functionality of the roof, what the roof is for, right? So that was what happened in Malaysia, where there was a lot of thinking about the roof. And then you have Jimmy Lim with Kampong-Minium and the architecture, the timber architecture that he employed. Many of his bungalows, the use of brickwork as well with timber, and the use of the bracket system, which is a traditional system that he embellished in his modern architecture. So we have a lot of these search for modern architecture through materiality to construction, through the sensibilities of using a touch and smell and taste, in terms of resort architecture or designing bungalows and villas as such. We have that in abundance. And also banks, the Bank Bumiputra at one time. I don't think it's there anymore. I can't see it, but is it there? I'm not sure. I haven't been there for a long time. But there was the adoption of the Minangkabau roof, also Terengganu roof, but one Malay traditional forms onto a modern building that's air-conditioned, by the way. So what Mitch says here in this last paragraph is, in architecture, it is best to keep this question open and explored about identity, obviously. The moment we give an absolute answer to the question, we have already closed our universe. For example, it's all about roof forms, or it's all about tropical architecture, or it's all about adopting regional ideas or motifs. So we are closing our universe or closing our minds to actually talking about identity. If architecture is a form of knowledge, architecture and identity is worth to be perceived as a living organism, where it will continue to emerge, expand, and being alive, says Mitch. Architecture, by any definition, is a story. As a living creature, we differentiate ourselves by creating dreams and stories. It is a way of talking about our hopes, dreams, and aspirations. The narrative is always about going back into the past, coming into the present, and projecting it into the future, and finding moments in these three conditions, which I assume is the concept, context, and content, that are relevant, special, significant, and close to our hearts. So he ended like, the meaning of things, this is a quote from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. The meaning of things lies not in the things themselves, but in our attitude towards them. Right. Thank you so much, Mitch. I'm using your posts. I didn't ask for permission, but I'm sure that I'm going to copy this podcast episode right there so that it would represent my argument with regard to what you have posted. Now, when putting in CCC with identity, what is the closest of all the C's? The closest would be context, isn't it, with people. But people have changed from then and now. So when you talk about the past, what lessons have we learned from the past, says your mental health guru, so that you will learn those lessons? Well, definitely we were to look at the book by, I think it's called The Malay Traditional House by Lim Yi Juan. We can see all the principles of Malay architecture that we can learn. But that's in a small scale, in a habitat or a small dwelling. But all architecture are dwellings, by the way. So they're complex nature and they need to be broken down somehow. Because what are scale but the feeling of being away from home, of being nurtured, of being comforted by a sense of dwelling. The sense of dwelling is another issue that I'd like to incorporate into here, because if we're going to put context in, we're going to think about phenomenology. I'm referring to the book by The Concept of Dwelling by Christian Norberg Schultz, for example, whereby when you feel at home, I mean, we're talking about identity. And if I were to say I identify as so-and-so, I identify as an architect, or I identify as a parent or a mother or a father or a daughter or a son. I identify as a lawyer. I identify as, what am I comfortable with? I'm comfortable with my language. I'm comfortable with familiarity, a sense of comfort, right? So if I want to do a museum, a war museum, like what Libiskin did in Manchester, I want to have a narrative that is going to take me into a place where it is skewered, it is dark, it is reflecting on the past, it is mourning, it is grieving. I don't feel comfortable in that. Just say most of our buildings are to do with schools, to do with community centers, to do with libraries and markets, and to do with the everyday, the office environment, the hospital, clinics, to do with housing. Those are dwellings that give us a sense of comfort. So if I were to use Libiskin idea or the deconstructivist idea, it is more for akin to the museum, and depending on what museum it is. So the whole issue of identity with regard to the building type called museum is something else. Like we have Museum Negara in Kuala Lumpur that was done in the style of a traditional Malay architecture roof form that is quite prevalent in that design, the first building that is there now. And then you have all the extensions, of course. But that depict a monumentality, an identity that is akin to a monumentality. That depict as if I need to be conserved because I represent the nation's wealth of cultural information. So whatever that you go into there, you'll be thinking about, yes, this is the building of where all my culture and tradition, artifacts from the past is there. But not all architecture has to be identified that way. For a school, for example, you can design a school as an open-minded human being that allows all sorts of reading and learning of the world. Meaning that it is very open, it's very wide, it gives a lot of spaces, interesting different variety of spaces. It gives accessibility, safety, and usability. And it gives a lot of freedom for thought and adventure. And then you will go into classroom that is having some sense of communal sense in there. So identity links with the context first, then all the other C's. And when it links with the context, it links with the people. Only then it will make sense that you're talking about identity, because identity is to do with recognition, love, appreciation of cultures, of social cultures, of being with others, exchange of ideas, of being comforted by a space that is safe and secure to learn, for example, when you talk about schools. And then you can go into hotels or whatever the other building types that you wish to talk about. The context, which is who is using it, the user. Mitch Moss has opened a dialogue, and I hope a lot more people would give their opinion with regard to this. And he's put in beautiful keywords for us to think about. And I catch that one specifically because the locality, the place, the identity of the place. Place identity, whatever you call it, sense of place. There was place making. That sense of, if it's in Chowkit, or it's in Kampung Baru, if it's in particular Subang Jaya, or whatever, all these suburbs in Malaysia, then you identify what comfort, what sense of belonging, what sense of identity do these people want. That's why in terms of a museum design, we had this conversation earlier about museum design is not a very challenging design thesis, because you can go onto the design and create also some narrative that you can fantasize a lot, and then you can do whatever you like. And there's no challenge to that, because once you have a dialogue and a debate about identity, for example, that'd be interesting. So if you do a museum that has the issue of identity and the locality, then it will be interesting, because you actually create a dialogue in which people could actually converse with you and try to find meaning between what you're trying to say, or the stories and the narrative that you try to engage with others, which is what some of the things that all students of architecture need to do, that is engaging with more and more and trying to debate about things. There I have it. This is the podcast, especially for Mr. Mitch Moss out there. Thank you so much. And this is dedicated to you and your fine Facebook posts on concept, context, and content. Thanks, Mitch. I hope you're good. Bye.